I am going to speak relatively briefly, if professors can do those things, on my book, which is entitled Walk With Us and Listen. The title of this book comes from an old man who I met in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe a short while after the Matabele massacre, and sort of found myself being quite apologetic being there. You know, these sort of political tourists. You ask questions. And he said, listen, we're delighted. Please come, stay with us, walk with us, but listen, don't tell us what to do. And I've carried his wise words with me ever since, and so when I started trying to put this manuscript together, those are the words that came to mind. The focus of this particular book is on justice and peace in the African context. Difficult exercise to balance those two issues. A central question within the book is whether interventions by, for example, the International Criminal Court into various parts of Africa either hinders or promotes sustainable peace and justice in that particular continent. And I am suggesting, I suppose, by way of the footnote, that perhaps conversation on the International Criminal Court needs to happen again. And as you know, this court, or the Rome Treaty, which gave rise to this court, is up for review. And the review will interestingly take place in Kampala, in Uganda, next May, I understand it. Just for those of you who may not be totally familiar with the background to this ICC debate, International Criminal Court, it was established with the necessary 60 ratifications in July 2002. Those 60 ratifications included the ratifications coming from 30 African countries. Today there are 110 states around the world that have ratified the treaty. As we stand at the moment, and this thing changes day to day, but my understanding is that a further 38 states have signed the treaty but not ratified it. Either not yet ratified it or not having ratified it for some other reason. There are also, interestingly, 3 states, namely Israel, Sudan, and the United States of America, who have unsigned the Rome Treaty to ensure that there are no legal obligations on them that arise from being signatories of the statute. And in fact, the United States has gone a step further by signing bilateral agreements with individual countries with whom it is engaging, whereby the signatories would pledge not to hand over each other's nationals to the ICC, even if they were accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. So if we can take that as this interesting intervention into international politics, namely the International Criminal Court, I want this afternoon, by way of trying to provoke some sort of discussion, because the discussion is the most interesting part, to offer 3 comments. My first comment is this: that universalism and globalization are very often diametrically opposing concepts. Globalization and universalism are not one and the same thing. Universal human rights come not from a globalized imposition of one set of values on everybody else. They are not exported. universal values, are not exported from one center of power to the rest of the world. And in order for human rights to attain mutual acceptance in faraway places, those values need to emerge, I am suggesting, from an unabating struggle and debate in the world as a whole in pursuit of some sort of ethical idealism towards which we ought to strive. Differently stated, international principles emerge as the distillation of a universal quest for human dignity. And without this inclusive participation in this quest, the possibility of imposing these universal values withers away and is usually not very effective. In brief, the stronger the leading power is at the center of the imposition of values, the less likely it may be that those nations on the periphery will either accept or understand. Now, I am not suggesting, as some do by the way, I am not suggesting that the ICC is a self-conscious imperial intervention into Africa. I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting that its perspective on Africa is largely influenced by what some in Africa call the New York Consensus. An African leader recently observed to me in Sudan, well, first the colonialists came with their guns. Next they came with their money. And now they have arrived with their morality to tell us how to behave. I want to suggest this afternoon that the encounter between Africa and the First World is more subtle than that. It's not naked imperialism. And I think we would be making a grave error if, however, we fail to recognize the growing antagonism there is in some African and other third world circles towards international institutions such as the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, etc. Let me just offer two examples. Having repeatedly called for the reform of the United Nations, South Africa, my native land, voted controversially with China and Russia against a draft UN security resolution on the shocking human rights and abuses in Myanmar or Burma. South Africa argued at the time that the correct venue for addressing this matter is the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it was not prepared to condone a debate within the Security Council where 5 nations had a veto power. And we need to note this sense of unhappiness. Or, more poignantly, is the more recent encounter between the African Union and the United Nations General Assembly, Security Council, excuse me. The AU had requested the Security Council not to proceed with a warrant for the arrest of Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir. It made this request in order to give the Africans a further opportunity to facilitate a negotiated settlement around the Darfur crisis, a process that the African nations had been involved in since 2004. This request was rejected by the Security Council, who proceeded to authorize the ICC to issue the warrant for Bashir's arrest. The heads of states belonging to the AU, in a summit held in Libya in July 2009, expressed, and I use the quotation, grave concern that the indictment of al-Bashir will have a negative impact on the delicate peace processes underway in Sudan, unquote. Proceeding to state that they would not be prepared to cooperate with international forces for the arrest of Bashir. Now, whenever I say a word about Bashir, I always feel that I need to add that I'm in no way seeking to defend al-Bashir. I think he's a thug. Few countries, a few countries, have of course recanted on the words that were used in that AU declaration, South Africa among them, in saying that they would not be prepared to cooperate. African countries are, however, asking, why is it that the international community, and more specifically the ICC, is not showing the same concern in relation to other nations? In the Gaza war, Israel, Palestine, what about the Russians, Chechnya, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan? We can go on and on. Why is it that Africa is being singled out in this situation? In a recent edition of the New African Journal, it asks the question, what is the ICC up to? Forget the rhetoric, says a leading article. The ICC is just another excuse for superpower bullying. This is not a court set up to book prime ministers of the United Kingdom or presidents of the United States. It is this that makes many in Africa watch with particular interest in what the response is going to be and what the nature of the investigations will be in the United States, for example, concerning the Bush administration's war on terrorism, as well as the outcome of the United Nations-sponsored investigation by Judge Richard Goldstein into alleged atrocities in the Gaza area. If international law is to be respected, it cannot be reduced to a form of law that is imposed either through the barrel of the gun or through the sheriff knocking at the door and saying, here is the warrant. It cannot be imposed through what Hannah Arendt has so powerfully referred to as legal violence. This was a form of law that was tried unsuccessfully by colonialists. It is a form of law that has been tried unsuccessfully by post-colonial dictators in Africa. In brief, I am arguing that the legal and moral values that we seek to impose at an international level needs to be accepted by, appropriated by, owned by, and promoted by those who are required to live in accordance with those values. If that does not happen, what is called international law will continue to be regarded with great suspicion, I would suggest, in many third world countries around the world. I am suggesting that the ICC's activities in Africa may well be a turning point on the possible role of the ICC in situations of conflict. And so my first point, does the apparently unilateral intervention by the international community through the ICC into countries in Africa, does that promote or does it hinder the kind of peace and justice for which we stand? My second point, and professors just ask questions, so they don't have to answer. That's my first question. My second is this. I want to suggest that there is a danger of the ICC being used by the world and by African leaders to get rid of their political enemies. Consider the Democratic Republic of the Congo for a moment. And I know we have at least one gentleman here from that part of the world. As a result of the Rome Statute and the birth of the ICC, which the DRC has ratified, with the cooperation of President Kabila in the DRC, 4 Congolese have been arrested for their involvement in acts which are designated in the Rome Statute. All enemies of the sitting president. The most interesting one, of course, is that Bosco Ntaganda, a former military chief of a rebel movement on the eastern borders of the Congo, has had a warrant issued by the ICC for his arrest. Mr. Kabila, however, has chosen not to honor this warrant, but to take Mr. Nkatanga into the armed forces, the government forces of the DRC. On the other hand, it has called upon Rwanda to release Nkunda, who was another rebel leader, to release him into their custody so that he can be handed over to the court in The Hague. And so the question is, what is Kabila doing? And what is the role of the ICC in that part of the world? He is using it to ensure the warrant for the arrest of certain people who are his enemies, and he is disregarding the warrant as it applies to other people in that part of the world who he seeks to draw onto his side. And so my question is really, is the ICC a vehicle for peace and justice in the Congo? Or is it illegitimately, wrongly being used by Kabila to further his own ends? And let me take that question just one step further. If we see what is happening in Darfur as possible genocide, very likely a crime against humanity, decidedly a war crime, if we are going to say that, why is it that the international community is not being judged the slaughter of the Hima and Lendu people on the eastern border of the DRC as something worthy of their consideration? Now, here's the good news, I hope. It does seem that this situation could be addressed as a result of President Obama's decision to appoint Howard Wolpe as the special advisor and envoy for the United States in the Great Lakes region. So maybe this is beginning to be rethought. But decidedly at the moment, we've got to say that Mr. Kabila has been able to use international law to his own benefit. Now, I'd be very interested in the response to that. Or let's return to Sudan. The US has not ratified the Rome Statute. It has, however, supported the Security Council decision in favor of the ICC warrant for al-Bashir. Question is, how is international law being used? By whom in the political scramble that is taking place in Africa and other parts of the world? I pose 2 questions. Let me come to my third point, which I hope is a little more conciliatory. I am arguing that a change of tactics by the ICC as a basis for their intervention into areas of conflict, rather than their total withdrawal from African states, is what is being asked for. Diane Orentlicker, teaches at American University, draws on Bishop Berkeley's question when he asks whether a tree really fell in the forest if nobody heard it fall. A lovely question which I use so often. She uses the question to ask whether prosecutions such as those taking place through the ICC in The Hague, whether the tree has in fact been seen to have fallen in Africa. Ought these people not to be tried within their own contexts? And if they choose not to try them, the question is open. She's in fact echoing the recommendations of a very important rule of law working group of the Dag Hammarskjöld Symposium regarding the respect for international law. An organization that says this, and I quote, "More support needs to be given to the rule of law budgets in Africa for building institutions and practices of good governance, and less money needs to be spent on showy projects of interest that interest only the international community." The report argues that a balance needs to be struck between universal norms associated with the rule of law and respect for local, national, and regional values, and that greater reliance should be placed on local and regional associations of judges and lawyers, and less on interventions of the kind that we know. Now, all I'm doing is arguing that the moral concerns that many of us, myself included, have about justice issues in Africa can best be handled in working alongside judicial structures in these particular countries, rather than the kind of intervention that comes from without. I am suggesting that international law is something that needs to be introduced into the debate, into the training, into the education, into the dialogue, into the peacemaking that is happening in African countries, and this would be more effective than sending in a sheriff with a bright star to arrest and take somebody off to The Hague or somewhere else. My concern is that the overemphasis on the ICC prosecutions in Africa to the neglect of the rest of the world is too often at the cost of seeking to heal a broken and a destroyed continent. A closing comment. I've raised 3 issues. In closing, think about this for a moment, if you will. Had the Rome Statute been ratified and enforced in apartheid South Africa in 1994, we would decidedly not have had a negotiated settlement. The apartheid generals and government leaders would not have been prepared to lay down their arms if they knew that they would have their day in court in 6 months or 5 years' time. I am simply arguing that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to dealing with past atrocities. I am suggesting that the international community has a right, and indeed in terms of international law has an obligation to engage and to seek to influence a peacemaking process. It does not have the right to dictate the terms of a settlement. There is a growing sense in some African circles that ICC interventions onto the African continent are not helping the peace process. The situation has changed in Africa since several years ago, when 30 African states ratified the Rome Treaty. The situation has changed. And world bodies cannot ask Africans to take responsibility for their own affairs and to police their own continent and to ensure respect for human rights in their own continent. They cannot ask them to do that. And then the moment they seek to do that in a controversial situation such as Sudan, they blow the whistle and issue a warrant for the arrest of the president. You can't have your cake and eat it. And my plea is, the basis of the argument in my book is that we've got to find a new basis for there to be dialogue, for there to be conciliation, and for there to be joint peace building by the international world taking the African Union a lot more seriously than it does. So you needn't read the book. You now know what it says. But you must buy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I will keep my comments very brief before we open up for discussion. First of all, I would very much recommend that you read the book. It is very well written. A couple of comments about the book. First of all, it's rare that academics actually time publications like this well, but this is brilliantly timed because, as Charles mentioned, the Rome Treaty is up for review, and I would recommend that everyone involved in that review should be obliged to read this book. A second point is that Charles's main thesis really is relevant to all the world. It's not just Africa. The issue involves the workings of the International Criminal Court, whether or not it is going to apply certain principles around the world in a uniform way, or whether it is going to selectively identify criminals in certain parts of the world and not others. I've discussed this under the label the new global American dilemma. As you know, the original American dilemma involved race, where the United States, on the one hand, talked about and talks about liberty and equality, etc., and on the other hand, there was historically slavery, then segregation. And that American dilemma was eventually resolved. Now, the new global American dilemma involves talking about and supporting democracy and justice very selectively. So certain dictatorships are supported, others are not. Certain dictators are prosecuted, others are not. And this uneven application of principles leads to all kinds of problems. I'll leave you with a little story. My father was a Sufi follower and used to teach me through Sufi stories. And one of these Sufi stories involves Nasruddin. Nasruddin is a character you come across in much of the Near and Middle East. And Nasruddin was challenged by his friends one day. They wanted to get a meal out of him. They said, look, Nasruddin, if you are willing to go outside the town and sleep there by yourself one night, we will buy you a wonderful meal. And he said, that's great, I'd like to take that offer up. And they said, but if you fail, you have to buy us a meal. And he said, well, okay, but that doesn't sound too bad. So they took him outside town and they said, well, you have to be here by yourself and you mustn't make a fire. There mustn't be anything to warm you up. He took up the challenge, and the next day they all came back after the evening that Nasruddin had spent outside by himself, and they came back and they found him there. He hadn't deserted his post. And they said, well, what happened? He said, nothing. I was just very cold, but I just stood up to the task, and here I am. You owe me a meal. And they said, well, wait a minute. Did you make a fire? He said, no, no fire. And they cross-examined him again and again until he said, well, yes, I could see the distant light of the village. And they said, aha, that's what kept you warm. We've got you. You cheated. You have to buy us a meal. So he said, okay, well, they forced him so that the next week everybody gathered at Nasruddin's house. There were hundreds of people with their relatives and friends all at his house waiting for the meal. And they waited and waited and waited, and no meal came. Finally, they were so hungry, they said, look, where is this meal? And he said, well, it's cooking. And they said, where is it? You have to show us. And he took them outside, and at the top of a tree, he had hoisted a big pot. And at the bottom, there was a little candle. And they said, you idiot, how do you expect this candle to cook that pot right at the top of the tree? And he said, well, just in the same way as you expected a little distant light to warm me at night. So to apply the principle evenly, that's the trick. We'll open up for questions. Yes.
Charles, thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is about the antagonism that you're sensing among African governments about the ICC and about international institutions in general. And I just wonder if you have a sense as to the interplay between that elite governmental reaction and the popular sentiments about these institutions, or if there's any interplay, what have you. I mean, you point out South Africa, and South Africa being democratic, I'm wondering to what extent does public opinion and the ability to express it play into any of the maneuverings at the elite level about international institutions and their relations?
Yeah, Professor Taylor asks a very pertinent question, of course. And it's somewhat difficult to take a precise reading on that. To what extent is the annoyance that exists amongst the African elite or the ruling class, for example, concerning ICC interventions, is this shared by people on the ground? I think one can only offer two comments, Scott. The one is, as you will know very well, sir, there have been two recent surveys in the northern part of Uganda, in the Acholi land area. And indications are that people on the ground are pretty divided on this one. But in the end, they are saying that they could live with the Juba settlement, provided it did in fact bring peace. I think one needs to say that. I think the other thing that one needs to say is that peace building anywhere in the world is rarely, if ever, made by ordinary people. It is made between the elite. You know, and I remember so well, how can I not remember? I remember so well that when Mr. Mandela was released from prison in South Africa, some of the angry young Turks in the African National Congress said, hey, this old man's lost it. I mean, he's got soft after 27 years in prison. We're not prepared to settle in this thing. We're going to fight the Boers until it's over. I remember attending a meeting where Mr. Mandela addressed ANC cadres and others in Cape Town. And he said, listen, I've heard your criticism. All I'm asking is that you give me a chance. And if I don't bring peace to this nation on peaceful terms, I want you to get rid of me. Well, the rest is history. The point being that the decision for a settlement of a soft kind was made at a leadership level, but the leaders were then able to go out into the community and persuade their people to accept this and to follow. So what one needs, of course, if we're going to have settlements to many of these disputes in Africa, is what we need anywhere in the world, is leadership that's able to lead. You know, my students are sick and tired of hearing this, but the great German philosopher Hegel said, the sign of a great leader in history is someone who's one step ahead of his people or her people in order to lead, but never more than one step, so that he or she can feel identify and understand the fears and the hopes of the people. So I think what we need is leadership on these levels. Scott, and you and I spoke about this recently. Who was it? Ali, you were the guy who said that South Africa had that settlement because of somebody whose name was Nelson Mandela.
Thank you very much for your talk, Charles. And I had two quick questions. So one is there's a fascinating book, which I'm sure you've read, by Helen Coban, where she operationalizes the cost of international transitional justice. And she breaks down the cost of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Her case is $42 million versus $1,000 for DDR process and $400 for Gacaca. So one is, we talked about the importance of supporting rule of law national budgets, and has the amount of funding for either local level or national budgets increased? That's one question. The other question is, part of the challenge with transitional justice and international legal norms is there's no international legal norms. There's a long history, a lot of treaties, and lots of lawyers. In transitional justice, kind of alternative processes, there's no equal international level. There's no international standard for transitional justice. It's mostly coming from civil society. I'm just wondering, do you see any trend where the international community is going to come together and say, here's kind of the international consensus on transitional justice, when it might be appropriate to do truth commissions? Is there going to at some point be kind of an architecture of that? It's not just coming from civil society.
Well, Craig, I mean, you've given the figures. How much does it cost to put a person through international justice, the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda, in Arusha, excuse me, for Rwanda in Arusha, as opposed to, for example, the Gacaca courts? I mean, it's just huge. But Brian, you and I were talking over lunch, and we were referring to a gentleman, Gerald Gaima. In my book, have got an extensive quote from Gaima saying, if we in Rwanda had the resources for the Gacaca courts that was given to Arusha, we would have transformed this country. I mean, the imbalance is just huge. So I'm always scared of lawyers, including Brian, because they usually have lots of money and they're very wise. But I think peacemaking and peace building involves people beyond the legal profession as well. But yeah, you're right, it's money. The economy's stupid.
Sorry.
You spoke a little bit about the dialogue between the AU and United Nations on the Sudan. And I'm wondering if you think the AU will play a greater role in regional and local initiatives related to peace building in the future. And if you think they would be able to better incorporate international rule of law as opposed to it coming from the outside.
Yeah, Tamar, I mean, that's the pertinent question. It's the essence of the question that I asked Bob Rotberg the other day at a presentation that he gave us. We spoke a few minutes later, and I said, listen, you've given a very negative assessment of Africa, which I agree with, but do you think the AU can rectify this? And he said, no, not at all. So I said, that's a quick answer. He said, yes, they got no money. They got no money. And so I think it is really Craig's comment that unless the AU has money and resources to intervene effectively, they're not going to be able to do a great deal. There are many who said that the ICC warrant for Bashir came because the AU had been so ineffective since 2004, they hadn't been able to pull anything off, and that's why the world body just said, look, it's time for us to step in and arrest this guy. Well, the AU's response to that is that when they agreed to put soldiers in the field, AU soldiers on the ground, there was a commitment from the international world to provide money and resources for that intervention, which they never got. And so many of those soldiers were left sitting in camp. They were unable to go out and do what they had to do. So my argument, Tamar, is that if there is going to be peace in Africa or Southeast Asia or goodness knows anywhere else, there's got to be cooperation of a material kind as well as an intellectual kind, if you like, between international bodies and local bodies. But then there's got to be money to operationalize this. sir.
One set of actors that seems to be missing from your discourse are the actual victims of these crimes. These victims who are often disempowered, who lack political momentum to pressure these elites into bringing them justice. And thus, is there now a certain obligation for the international community to come in and empower those victims who without their help would be voiceless?
Look, to the extent that the international community is involved, as to the extent that NGOs, international and local, are involved in empowering victims and survivors to ensure that they in turn influence their own particular leaders to see that their needs are met, that there is reform, that there be reparations, etc. That is great. I mean, that's fine. But effectively, there is no evidence of this empowerment of victims really happening anywhere in the world, including my country. You know, the weakest part of the settlement in South Africa in the end was the limited response by authorities, by the elite, to pay reparations. But sometimes victims and survivors, quite understandably, are making demands upon a government that does not always contribute to the kind of reconstruction and healing and good governance that is required overall for that country to function. You know, I've criticized the South African government for failing to pay reparations the way they should. The South African government comes back and it says to those of us who are critical, our first responsibility is to ensure that we've got a decent, stable, economically viable state so that these victims and their children and their grandchildren will one day have what they don't have. So it's a tough one. But governments have got to be pressurized, otherwise they don't deliver. Simple as that. You're right.
Do you foresee any, either under the auspices of the AU and Chairman Gaddafi's consideration that maybe the AU should pull out of the Rome Statute during the review conference in 2010? Do you see this happening? And do you see this, if this did happen en masse, or maybe one or two countries pulling out, do you see that as the end of the Rome Statute and as an effective, or at least decently effective, way of achieving some semblance of justice?
I think if that happened, that would indeed be the outcome. If the African countries withdrew in some substantial number, I certainly think the International Criminal Court would be in quite serious trouble. I would hope it doesn't go there. I think there is space for the AU to communicate its concerns to the ICC and for the ICC to hear the criticism that is coming, so that there can be international law to leverage these states, but at the same time to respect the decisions that those states may make. But I hope we don't go there, because it would be a retrogressive step.
Yeah, my question's about Kenya, and
just talk up a bit, sir.
My question's about Kenya.
Kenya, right.
Recently, Ocampo visited Kenya, and he had stated that his goal would not be to prosecute everyone, but the so-called big fish. And originally, the Kenyan government was very supportive of him before they started backpedaling. And the general feeling amongst the Kenyan public is that there's no way that this same government, which contains some of the accused perpetrators of this conflict, can create a system that's good enough to charge the same people who have created the system. Mm-hmm. So there's an agreement that there needs to be an external actor. So my question for you is that, do you not see this as a case where the ICC could be actually beneficial?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you raise what, in my humble opinion, is one of the most interesting places, perhaps in Africa today, when we start talking about transitional justice and the role of the international community. You're absolutely right. Let me just remind you what the Rome Statute says, and that is that if a local nation either does not have the capacity or doesn't have the desire to take legal action against those who are allegedly responsible for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, then it will intervene. Against whom? Against the major perpetrators of those particular crimes. The ICC has never said that it will, arrest everybody in Kenya who's alleged to be guilty, or anywhere else. So, just want to clarify that. That is the tension. It's the tension in Kenya today, and it was the tension in South Africa in 1994. What do you do with these guys who, by anybody's account, are thugs? Can you expect them to continue to rule the country into the future? Now let me just throw one more thing in there to complicate the issue a little further. You'll remember that in Eastern Europe, the decision was to have lustration. And what did that mean? It meant that those people who were party to the old regime, who may have been in government before, or may have been paid spies before, they were not permitted to participate in new structures, whether at the level of teaching or as civil servants or as politicians or anyone else. Again, trying to wrestle with this very issue that you're raising, that you can't have those people building a different kind of society. Well, in effect, Eastern Europe hasn't worked too well as that. And we know that many of the current leaders of many former Eastern European countries are in fact former communists. Can a leopard change his or her spots? I don't know. There are some people in some of those countries who have been able to come over to the other side and contribute to the healing process. And I think that's the one that Kenya is going to have to wrestle with. What do you do with those people? And who makes the decision as to who they are? If we're going to prosecute 12 people in Kenya, which 12?
Well, they have the Waki list drawn up, so...
Excuse me?
They have the Waki list that has been drawn up, and they're waiting to open it. So
Yeah.
the names contained in the list...
But that's going to be a controversial one, as you know. How do you make a decision? Who makes the decision? According to what criteria? What happened in Mozambique? We said, hey, this is so complicated, we're just going to forget about the whole thing. And we're going to go ahead and put all our eggs into that basket called development. And we're not going to ask who should be prosecuted, who shouldn't be prosecuted. It's a tough one. It's very tough. Scott?
You spoke very eloquently about the consequences of ICC indictments and so on, and the public reaction. But you said at the beginning that you didn't want to go down the sort of the imperial explanation or neo-imperial explanation road. But I wonder if you would just comment briefly on what you see as the causes for why Africa is singled out. Is it because African war criminals and so on represent the low-hanging fruit, or are there some other global geopolitical explanation?
Look, again, Scott, I mean, as you know, this is a nice provocative question. I don't think Africa has more crooks than the rest of the world. I don't think African politicians are, by definition, more corrupt than leaders elsewhere in the world. I think there's a couple of factors here. The one I've suggested, that namely those 5 people who have had warrants against them issued in the Congo are who? Those that Kabila has handed over. The same as the Sudanese situation with the Lord's Resistance Army rulers, Kony and so on. The warrants have been issued for their arrest with the support of Museveni, the president. So I think in many instances these things are happening because Africans see this as an opportunity to use the ICC. The second thing, let me be honest, it's easy to pick on the small boys on the block. It's easy to pick on some little country tucked away in Africa somewhere. If you want to issue a warrant for somebody in China, or the United States, or the UK, or France. You're taking on something, my brother. So you might want to think before you get involved in that. I think these are the issues that are involved. You know, but Africans have behaved badly. And they've opened themselves up to this sort of behavior. They really have. But one hopes that through the formation of the AU, with all its failures and with all its limitations, some of these things will begin to be addressed. It's the African Human Rights Court, these sorts of things. It's hardly got off the ground. These are the institutions that I would argue the international community ought to be strengthening and empowering so that they can do their job.
I could ask one last question.
Yes, sir.
What would your advice be to the International Criminal Court as to how it could strengthen itself, particularly in relation to the United States and the American tactic now of having bilateral negotiations and treaties whereby they've pulled out of the Treaty of Rome and basically trying to undermine the whole process? What would you suggest could be done?
Look, I think there are three things. One is to ensure even-handedness, so that whatever is done, nobody can say, why pick on us? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're going to intervene in Sudan, why don't we intervene in Palestine and Israel or Colombia? You know, we've got to be even-handed. I think that's number one if the ICC is going to have credibility. Number two, I do think there is a need, Ali, to ensure that there is meaningful engagement between the officials of the ICC, the leadership, and its most severe critics. Make sure the critics are inside, engaging in the decision-making process. And in many instances, the ICC is really empowered largely by those who are either Western themselves or are influenced in that direction. I think there are other resources that can be drawn on. So that's the second one. There ought to be more, there ought to be even-handed, there ought to be more engagement and debate. And the other thing is, I think somebody next year, Brian, has got to look at that Rome Treaty and got to look at Article 16 and 17 and a few others, and where the treaty says that if it's in the interests of justice, the warrant ought not to be issued, or to be withheld, or to be suspended. Who makes the decision in that situation? Is it Mr. Ocampo? Is it a few people in New York? Who makes that decision? And that's a tough one. But I think those are the credibility levels which the ICC would have to work on. And so, you know, I think the arrival of the ICC, the establishment of the ICC, is one of the most important steps in the struggle for human rights in the world. I'm just desperately concerned that they're not exercising it with the efficiency that they should. I was in a discussion the other day. Somebody asked this question. The speaker, who wasn't me, said, what can they do? The first thing to do is to get rid of Ocampo. He's overstepped the line. Now, Brian, you can answer that. I don't know. But he is a very participatory prosecutor. Maybe he should just stand back and come across as less provocative, less promotion in all that he's doing. Can I just throw in one last illustration? We can go home. And my students again have heard, you know, I've done quite a bit of work in Mozambique. Got to know a lovely woman there, Erik Doxtader. She was born somewhere in Latin America, but she spent most of her life in Mozambique. A wonderful woman who fought on the side of the Portuguese force, of the Mozambican forces against the Portuguese colonists. And she fought on the side of Frelimo against Renamo. And I said to her, Ray, looking back, when all is said and done, terrible atrocities in that country. Looking back, Ray, ought there to have been prosecutions? I mean, you as a Frelimo person, ought you have to prosecuted some of those people from Renamo in the north? And she said, really? Who should we have prosecuted? Why pick on Renamo? Why pick on Frelimo? What about the Rhodesians, the white Rhodesians who started that war? What about the South Africans who put troops in the field in support of that war? What about the Americans who funded that war? Why pick on the Renamo people? Why pick on Frelimo? I said, well, do you think some sort of a truth commission would have helped? Should you have given people a cathartic moment to get it off their chests and speak about the atrocities? She said, you know, we like an extended family in this little country. We all know what happened. We all know who did what to whom. And she used the illustration. She said that, you know, here in Maputo, in Mozambique, the conflict between Renamo and Frelimo existed between the sheets of the marriage bed. We just had to put it behind us and go on. And you know, when I came back from Mozambique and having heard her story, I said to myself, well, Mozambique have said they're going to move on through a process that they call reconciliation through silence. We in South Africa spent a small fortune on a truth commission. And I wonder whether we are more reconciled than Mozambique.